seen that when we classify mankind by color, the only one of the primary races given by this classification which has not made a creative contribution to any of our 23 civilizations is the black race. Within the first 6,000 years, the black race has not helped to create any civilization.
The old anti-slavery school says that women must stay back, that they must wait until male Negroes are voters. But we say, if you will not give the whole loaf of justice to an entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to be placed in the government, then let the question of white women be brought up first, and that of the Negro last.
There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufacturer among them, no arts, no sciences. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction betwixt these breeds of men.
The Negro is a child, and with children nothing can be done without the use of authority. We must therefore so arrange the circumstances of our daily life that my authority can find expression. With regard to the Negroes, then, I have coined the formula. I am your brother, it is true, but your elder brother.
You would say that Plato played a great role in creating what we today call the European?
Yes.
And for what reason now?
Yes. What I see is that in the development of European culture, which is an ongoing process, in the fulfillment of the Aili, that there are certain seminal points, seminal thinkers, doers, who at whatever point in history they were at, served a role of solidifying and further developing the definition of what it means to be European. Plato comes along and he uses the concept of truth, what would be called an epistemology, that's only the concept of truth, uses that as something around which people can come together and identify and say, okay, this is going to be us. Now, as I said, that didn't happen right away. He had to fight all these other people that would be dissonant, you know, voices. But eventually, yes, that became what Europeans identified with. They said this way of thinking, this rationalism, this extreme rationalism that helps us to control, it gives us the illusion that we are controlling the future, the past, the universe, and everything. This is us as European people. So he was key at that point. Now, then you get a little later stage. Here comes along, let's look at 312. What they call AD. Here comes Constantine. What does he do? He sees that what you need is a religious statement which will help to achieve this world domination, this power, help to bring these Europeans together so that they can have power over others. So he adopts Christianity, you see. And that gives him the model that he needs in order to say, we have the right, in fact, we have the mandate. He said he personally had the mandate, and you need to look at his own quotes and the things that were written about him, to go throughout the world and in the name of this one true God, which was them, which was the Europeans, to make everybody into these Christians.
So he's adopting Christianity as a weapon of control.
Absolutely.
Good evening and welcome to For the People. Any objective reading of history would conclude that at least for the last 500 years, the biggest roadblock to the development of black people around the world has been European imperialism. Europe's control over the resources and people of continental Africa, and Africans in the diaspora. Europe's devastating impact on the development of Africans through the terrorism of slavery is well known. The later colonialism period, wherein white nations engaged in economic and political cannibalism by carving up the body of Africa, is less well known. Then there is the vitriolic and venomous European attack against the very humanity of black people, as we heard at the beginning of this program. While Europeans in National Geographic magazine style has been studying the exotic peoples of color and animals around the world, there are relatively few works by black social scientists which take a critical, in-depth look at why Europeans think and behave the way they do. Dr. Donna Richards has been involved in the African liberation movement since her work as a field organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi from 1963 to 1965. Dr. Richards holds a BA degree in philosophy from the University of Chicago and MA and PhD degrees in anthropology from the graduate faculty of the New School for Research. Currently, she is an associate professor of African Studies in the Department of Black and Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College in New York City. Dr. Richards begins by explaining the title of her book, Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior.
Yurugu comes from Dogon mythology, small group of African people whom Europeans would consider probably primitive, unquote, who have a most complex cosmology. And in it, they talk about Ama, the creator, having created all beings with twin souls, the male and female part, and that represents the whole being. Yurugu was a being that tore himself away from the process of gestation, process of being born, so to speak, early, before Ama was finished creating him. Because he wanted, in his arrogance, he wanted to compete with the creator, with Ama, and create a better universe, a better, an earth actually, than Ama could create. When he came down from the heavens, came to begin the process of creation, he found that everything that he created was incomplete. That indeed he could not create perfection or anything with life because he himself was incomplete. Mm-hmm. He then realized that he was missing a part of himself. So he goes back to Ama to get his female part so that he could be whole. Ama had given that twin soul, that female part, away. So that Yurugu was in the state of searching for this other part of himself that would make him whole and never being able to find it. So that he was forever incomplete, could only create destruction, actually, could only destroy, and could never be fulfilled. That to me was a statement of what I saw in the nature of European cultural thought and behavior.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Why is this study important? Why did you undertake this study?
There's a personal reason. At the point that I was at when I began graduate studies, I saw us as African people always being put into a position when we would be in European or white academic institutions of being used to study our communities so that they can then use the information to control us. And I said that I would not be put into that position, and decided that as I was being taught European anthropology, I said, let me use some of this and see if I can turn it around and indeed study them and put them under the microscope. And that was the beginning of this process. I think the ideological reason, the political reason, most definitely was that Europeans have been very good at masking their intentions and their posture towards African people and other non-European people. And we have not understood what their purposes are, their intent towards us, have not understood their behavior. And I felt that this kind of study could help to unmask what in reality is the nature of Europeans.
So Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior, is about what?
It's about how European culture works as a consistent machine for the achievement of European power and total control of the universe. That's what it's about.
Lest some people think that this study is just for, or book is just for intellectuals and not for the working man and woman. Could you tell us some ways that European cultural thought and behavior have us working against ourselves?
One of the things that they do, I think that is very damaging, is the way in which they, how should I put it, train our children in schools to act against themselves and their people, to deny the aspects of themselves that really indeed are their strengths. We, of course, have experienced that, have been conditioned in this way, and it affects every single one of us. What you call the working Africans may be in a better position to begin to understand the kinds of things that I'm pointing to. It is the people who have been so indoctrinated within the academies that find it more difficult to critique, to look critically. Because the academy, since the time of Plato, back in 600, 700, 500 actually, years before the Common Era, the academy is the place that has been used to despiritualize the universe, has been used to promote a conception of truth that has no spirit in it. And we as an African people are a spiritual people. So that what it does is, these institutions do, is to take us away from ourselves. So the more time you spend in them, the more you are convinced that of this European reality, which is not a real reality, is not a reality for African people.
You make this statement in your introduction. This study was not approached objectively. It is not possible to be objective towards Europe. Explain that.
The concept of objectivity itself is something that has been used by Europeans to control African people. It is a concept which says that we can contemplate truth without being connected to any culture, without coming from any perspective, without having any political implications in what we do. That, of course, is not the case. And what we did was to accept this and say that, oh, they're scientists, they're scholars, and so forth. We're describing us objectively. What they were doing was promoting a particular way of viewing the world, promoting a particular political interest in the world. I do not make that claim because that claim, it would be a lie. And it is always a lie when, you know, you open up a book and somebody says, well, I'm being objective in doing this. How can you be objective? You are a human being, you're part of a culture, your people have had an historical relationship to other people. For any African person to say that they are being objective about Europe would be to say that they were being apolitical, non-political. We need to get away from that. So this is a very political work. It is meant to be.
If you told black people that white people were committing biological genocide against us and that by the year 2000 whatever there would be no more black people, you would get one reaction. But you're saying that we're being threatened with cultural and psychological extinction. How do you get African people to see the urgency of the situation?
I don't know, frankly, if you can. I think that we have to focus on young people, young African people who have not been so conditioned with a way of thinking that supports European imperialism, European power, that they still have the ability to use their intuition, their spirituality, their Africanness to create, to think beyond the limitations that have been given to them in European academies. I think most of us as adults, as elders, have been so conditioned that we're afraid to move beyond the parameters that have been defined by our enemies in our thinking, so that our vision is limited. And so we are really not the people who should be conceptualizing the plans, you know, the movements, what we should be building. But I focus on the younger people who hopefully are still more in touch with what is natural to African people. And if I can affirm that in them, they will see the urgency. I find that in my teaching. I find that in teaching young people, that once they are affirmed and introduced in a conscious way to the African worldview, it becomes crystal clear to them. And they see an urgency in us as African people building for self, as opposed to imitating forms which have been put in place to make sure that we continue to be oppressed.
Culturally and psychologically, do you think we realize what we have lost?
No, not. You know, it's ironic because we don't realize it on a conscious level, yet we live it every day. In the way we walk, in the way we talk, in the way in the music we create. There is a depth of spirituality which exists in us as a people, which has continued since our origins, that our ancestors have passed to us, and which we continue to pass on ourselves, that we don't consciously recognize as a strength. We don't realize that it is something that we need to use to think with, so that when we are presented with a European worldview in the classroom, we think that that's the only way to be. That's the only way to think, because we didn't come with anything. So I don't think that we are aware on a conscious level of what it is that we've moved away from in terms of power. You see, that's what we're not aware of.
Could you talk some about how we came to be who and what we are today? If you understand the question.
I think I do.
Okay.
I think that we have to look back at a period that I call the Ma'afa. We as Africans were very consciously stripped of our culture. Now, that becomes a platitude. You know, everybody's saying that. Stripped of our culture, but we have to see that we had a strong culture and so forth. But nobody seems to realize the depth of what that means. Being stripped of our culture meant being conditioned to accept ourselves as inferior beings, okay? It meant that we were conditioned to feel that we had to be dependent on Europeans, dependent on white people, that we could not do things for ourselves and in our own image. That conditioning began with a long period of terrorism, which was very physical, you know, physically manifested. At the same time, there was the breaking of the will. So there was cultural violence, I call it, you know, in the book, as well as the physical violence, which was very important. We then came to a period in which we mistakenly thought we were free. We're now at a point where we think that we have freedom, the ability to be whatever it is that we can be within this society and so forth. Yet what happens is that we are still thinking within a modality that has been determined by those who would oppress us, those who would control us. And we don't see beyond that. So the question for me becomes, who controls how you think? We have the ability to create our own structures, our own theories, our own definitions of reality, to look at the African worldview, to look at, for instance, the Dogon people, to look at the Kemetic people, to look at our own people who have, to even look at Carter G. Woodson, for instance, the miseducation of the Negro, which I don't think was really ever understood by us, and to use these things as inspirations for the building of institutions, the creation of things, the building our own buildings. We have the ability to do that. So it's almost like we've been conditioned so well through such a long process that now it is us who are enslaving ourselves mentally.
Because the job has already been...
The job has been done. It would be so easy, in one sense, for us to undo it. That's what I'm saying in this book. Because the way the system of European control works is that you have to accept a concept of reality which makes them superior. If you deny that, their thing will not work, and they will lose their control. So that they put all of this energy into establishing the system that begins when you're 3, 4, and so forth, which defines reality in such a way where there's no spirit, because they aren't a spiritual people, you see, which talks about this objective truth and so forth, which says that African spirituality represents backwardness, so you need to move away from it. It does all of these things which make you as an African person, me as an African person, us distrust the very part of ourselves, which is our strength.
I'm going to get back to this question, and that is this whole question of, do we know what we have lost? Do we realize that we have not always been Democrats, have not always been Baptist, have not always been Black Greeks, have not always been Links, have not always, how do we conceive of ourselves in a different time?
I think that there is a lot that is being done within the movement of African-centered education in that regard. In terms of, I think we have more information now that we've ever had before. And I have seen the effect of that information. That is very important, that people do begin to realize and understand, first of all, how young Europe is in relationship to Africa, and what we were putting into place, creating, building, conceiving of long before Europe existed. When you open people's minds to that, it can have a lot of power. So that I think that generally we have not understood that, but we have an opportunity to do so because of the work of many people now that is building on work that was done before that we didn't know about.
ETV. I will say then that I am not, or ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, not of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which will ever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And as much as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding blacks and tawnies of increasing the lovely white and red?
Good evening and welcome to For the People and the second part of our conversation with Dr. Donna M. Richards, author of Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. In this segment, Dr. Richards discusses, among other things, the role the Greek philosopher Plato played in creating the European way of thinking and behaving. But first, we begin with this question. As you say, other cultures have exhibited aggression, imperialistic tendencies. What accounts for Europe's success?
I'm glad you got to that question. Because what it allows me to do, I think, is to get at what I think is the specialness of the approach, the method that I used in this study. So it's going to take me a little while, if that's okay. I said to myself that, and this definitely was with the help of the ancestors, I want to, affirm that, by the way, that it was not...
Why is that important?
That's important because of our concept of connectedness, our concept of the universe, that it's not just words to talk of a spiritual universe and our spirituality as a people, but we've got to understand where our energy comes from. And I know that that's where mine came from. So this is ours. This belongs to us. I had to say, how would I approach studying the European given African conceptions? You see, it's one thing to say, okay, I want to do this, but then use their conceptions. What does it mean for us to really think in African terms? And so what I did was to develop concepts that came from an African worldview, not a European worldview. Okay. And I came up with the concept of Aili. I also used an African language. That's a Kiswahili word that means seed, origin, the essence of something. The reason that was important was because what people would say is, and they will say, oh, Europe is so vast. It is, there's so many different kinds of European forms and different countries. How can you talk about Europe as a whole? Now, of course, they've been talking about Europe as a whole all of this time, but when we begin to look at them, suddenly it's going to be, no, you can't really do this because it's too diverse. I needed a concept which could explain a culture in terms of its core, in terms of its ideological core, so that you could look at every different aspect of the culture and see how it fit into this one seed or core. And that's why I used the Aili. And the idea of the seed was that once that Aili is in place, that cultural Aili, that it will seek to fulfill itself. So the way in which the culture will develop will all be feeding into that Aili. And that would help me to get at consistency in terms of the European development. What throws us as a people is that we make exceptions. You know, we say, oh, well, that's different over here, and that's different. This is a good one over here, and this doesn't really work that way. But in my analysis, it's all consistent, and it's all working for one purpose. And the concept of Aili helped me to see that. And that comes to the answer to your question, is that what I was able to do was to see that the nature of the European Aili was to seek power. That it, in essence, is, we could almost say it is an Aili which lacks wholeness, and therefore must always see. Go back to Yurugu now. Remember Yurugu as the incomplete being that is always must be seeking, but can never be fulfilled because he can't get the complementary part of himself. Their Aili, the European cultural Aili, is incomplete, must always be seeking. Now, it cannot be fulfilled through spirit because they have no knowledge of spirit, no relationship to spiritual reality. Therefore, fulfillment is sought through power. And power here means power over other. And what that means is that everything within the culture, all of the development of European culture, all of the forms, all of the institutions, the ideas even, are all for the purpose of achieving European power. Now, your question was, if we can recognize that there have been imperialistic behaviors in other cultures, then what is the difference between European culture and these other cultures? And the answer is that Europeans have been most successful at achieving world domination because everything within the culture supports the quest for domination.
Everything.
Everything, including, and most importantly to me, their philosophical concepts, including their concept of truth, including their academies, academia, the intellectuals, including that. It works for, including Christianity as it manifests itself, you know, within the European development. All of that works for the achievement of European power.
Okay, okay. What would you say are the main features of African cultural thought and behavior that separate it from European cultural thought and behavior?
I think that that's a good question, because even to understand the nature of European culture, and how it works, what we need to begin with is the African worldview and how it works. That provides a frame of reference that you can then use. The African concept of the universe is as a spiritual whole, where everything is interrelated. That means that what is emphasized is not only spirit, but connectedness. And that we conceive of ourselves, we experience ourselves, I should say, as spiritual beings, that almost as cosmic beings. And by that I mean that we are connected to nature, to the forces of nature, to each other, in such a way that that's where we get definition and that's where we get strength. And so power for us becomes energy, the energy to do, to make things happen. We energize each other. Interaction becomes important. Complementarity becomes important. The relationship between spirit and matter is one in which they are connected, where material reality is understood as just the way spirit manifests itself. That's simply. On the other hand, in the European worldview and way of thinking, way of looking at the universe, human beings become separate and distinct individuals. The only way that you can know anything about the universe is to separate yourself from it, to take connectedness out of it, and thereby create what they call the object. That's all that you can know. Now, this object is a thing that has no feeling, no meaning, no spirit. Okay, that's an illusion in their minds, but it works for them, because if what Plato did, if we can go back to Plato, is that if he could get people to agree that this was the only truth, then what he could do is say that, well, the people who were closest to that truth, those are the people who should rule all the other people. So that worked within their culture. It gave him the basis for a hierarchy within Europe.
Now explain to me this creation of the object thing. I'm not clear on that.
Okay, what you do is, if you can, as a human being, first separate, make a split in yourself and say, there's part of me that thinks and there's part of me that feels. Now, in reality, that doesn't happen. You're a whole person. At least that's the African conception. But in his conception, that's what he said. That's what Plato said. Then what you say is, there's a part of me that's better than the other part of me. This thinking part is better than this other part. Okay? Then you say that the better part needs to either control or do away with that lesser part. So you got this thinking being.
This emotional part, or what?
The thinking part is getting rid of the emotional part.
Right.
Okay? Trying to control that. And so then what he says is, that's the only way that you can have knowledge. Okay? So here if you have somebody who is feeling, who is dealing with feelings, okay, or who is defined in that way, then they're the lesser person. They're the bad person. And they should be controlled by the person who is just doing this thought thing, you see, that they've constructed, all right? So within the state that he constructed, the republic, then he was able to say, base it all on this concept of the object, to say that these better people who could understand the object, who were not spiritually into things, they were the people who should control things. Well, look what happens then when you get nations relating to each other or cultures relating to each other. You say the culture that accepts this objective way of looking at truth, that's the creation of the object. That culture should dominate, control those that don't have that concept. They should control the more spiritual cultures, because they're the ones that are more civilized, more scientific, more rational, and all of those things.
Now I'm going to push you on this. This is a very difficult. This is a very difficult topic.
Right.
And I'm going to push you because we want to make sure that, first of all, I understand, and secondly, that everybody in the viewing audience understand the creation of this object. Can I push you? This object? I'm still trying to get at that.
Okay. It's always better for me to go back to our experience. Okay. Mm-hmm. For us, what I call a phenomenal universe is important. And to break that down, all we mean is that experience is important. The way we experience things is important in our knowing, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Go back to the European conception, the creation of the object. You take out experience. There should be no experience in there at all. There should be no connection. Okay? Another thing. For us, we learn through our involvement in the universe, in life. That, again, is experience. Go to the creation of the object. The way the object is created is by detaching the self from everything.
The object is what?
The object is the thing that is left when you detach yourself from the universe.
All right. Say that again. Say that
the
again.
object is what is left, and it's a thing. When you detach yourself from the universe.
Okay.
Think about Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am. Meaning that there's nothing else that is important about a human being except this ability to somehow do this thing of rational thinking on this object. That's all that makes you a human being. That's what makes you important. For us, you can't separate thought and emotion. They're part of, their thought and feeling are necessarily linked. And from that, we get intuitive knowledge, which is very important for African people.
What do the two do for each other? The emotional part and the quote, rational?
I think what they give is, they give us, for one thing, intuitive understanding of things. That is, for African people, like the ancients used to say, know thyself. What they meant by that is, we are like a microcosm of the universe. The universe exists in us. That's an African belief, okay? Therefore, if that's true, then by studying yourself, by knowing yourself, you come to know the universe. By coming to know the universe, you're coming to know yourself. That's why they said, know thyself, okay? If we accept the European concept, then you're left with a self with no relationship to the universe, no emotional involvement in the universe. It is detached, okay? But that was necessary to create that object. The important thing about the object was that it could be controlled. That's what Plato was getting at, and that's what has been accepted since his time. That in order to know, in order to be able to have knowledge, you had to be independent. Okay, that's what the separateness did for you. And that's what the lack of feeling did for you. It gave you control over something. What you control is the object. So we come back to the object. Now, if you look in terms of people and cultures, we become the objects.
Okay.
You see?
Okay.
That can be controlled, that can be acted on in any way necessary or possible. What do you do when you go into a scientific laboratory? You have these things that you can manipulate and do whatever you want with. That's the same way in which African people are treated, are related to by Europeans as objects that can be manipulated in whatever way has to be manipulated. Now, what we do is we feed into that by accepting their definitions of reality. Or we would understand, we're not objects. Hey, what are you doing? You see what I'm saying? That there is a spiritual reality that connects us to the universe and so forth and so on.
You've already touched on this, but what do you mean by spiritual universe? And what kind of universe did Plato, we're going to be talking about him a lot, I see.
Oh, boy. By a spiritual universe, we mean universe that is fundamentally spiritual in nature. That means that spirit is the fundamental reality. That means that there is a level of reality that gives meaning to everything else in the universe. It's like a foundation. It gives meaning to everything else, and it connects everything else. See, that's why rhythm, by the way, is so important to us as a people, because it's that which connects things. We believe in connectedness. We look for relationships, for interrelationships. Again, what Plato did was, what I believe is that connectedness, that rhythm in the universe is difficult for the European to understand, because they function on a level of a surface level, a literal level, not a multidimensional level with depth. And when you start talking about spirit, you're talking about multidimensionality, multi-levels. It gets deeper and deeper and deeper. When you talk about the object, what you're doing is that's just a very surface kind of reality. In all African systems, there are levels that you go to as you grow. In fact, life, a human life, is the development through stages of existence where you're learning more and more and more, you know, about yourself and the universe. So among the Dogon people, if I can go back to them, they have a level, the simplest level is called Jiri-So, G-I-R-I, then S-O, and it translates word at face value. For them, that is the most superficial level of learning. And they move from there to what they call word from the side, then word from behind, then clear word. So you're getting to deeper, you're gaining perspective. You see, you're getting textures of truth. You go to the object, you go to Plato's concept, and what you have is a very simplistic way of looking at reality that necessarily disconnects everything. It compartmentalizes. It separates. Go back to your question about what is the spiritual universe. The spiritual universe, that concept tells us that you cannot separate things, that there is some level on which everything is interconnected. Okay? That's one thing it means. It also means that we are focused on meaning. Not just what something appears to be, but what does it mean? How is it a symbol of a deeper sacred truth? That's what it means to think in terms of a spiritual universe. That's how we think as African beings. So it's powerful, but it's also difficult if it's not your nature, and maybe impossible if it's not your nature. You see, so what Plato was doing, and we really need to get beyond this because it's larger than Plato. Okay. Okay. But what he was doing was he came along at a time in European development where, in order to solidify and to concretize and to further develop the definition of what it meant to be European, he used thought. He said, if I can get people to agree to a certain way of thinking, then it can help to define who's going to be in charge of this hierarchy. Okay? And if you're dealing with a people who's, remember what the Africans said about the Greeks? What did they say? They said, you Greeks are but children. What did they mean? They meant that they could only approach reality on a surface level, that they couldn't understand the depth of the symbolism that was involved in African culture and in Kemetic civilization. So now, if he could get people to accept a definition of truth, which was simple in this way, you see, which did cut out the spirit, the rhythm, the connectedness, and so forth, then what he could do was to indeed affirm who he was. That's what they did. They defined truth in such a way that it affirmed them. It was indeed in their image.
Now, you say that his work was not very influential during the time that he lived. How did it become so influential?
Okay, when I say that it wasn't very influential, I mean that he was still fighting a battle, that there were still other views, and it was not popular, you know, at that time. But he had vision. That's what I believe, that he was definitely not a philosopher with his head in the clouds, as Aristophanes said about poking fun at the philosophers of the time, that he had a model, had a plan, and had a vision. So that what happens is the academy he puts in place, the academy becomes the institution which supports this concept of truth, which in turn supports the structure of the state that he's trying to build.
Okay.
Okay? Which includes slavery and everything else. After him, then you get these conceptions being developed by later, subsequent philosophers, even Aristotle, who is, you know, when you learn in school, he is contrasted with Plato, like his one big difference between Aristotle and Plato. From our point of view, in terms of cultural realities, in terms of the European Aili, they're like extensions of each other. He's just a continuance of that and put focus in a different area, further developed it, but has the same Aili. Then you come to the Neoplatonists. You come to even Augustine. I'm showing how Augustine's relationship to Platonic thought. And then you have, once you have the academy in place, and people should understand what I mean by the academy, that is where your scholars, you know, come out of. That is the basis for all of the educational system that we have and so forth. Once that's in place, it begins to grow and grow and grow, and till the point that what we have now is you don't have to argue for a particular concept of truth in the schools, say here in America. It is assumed the things that Plato was arguing for then. He had to argue, for instance, for the dominance of the written or literate modality over the oral. What had been the tradition was the reciting of oral epics and stories and so forth that everybody could get involved in. And there was a lot of emotional involvement and so forth. What Plato saw in that was he couldn't control that. It was a lack of control. There's too much participation, you see, from large numbers of people. But in terms of how they used writing, it becomes a mechanism for control. It's lineal in thinking, non-circular. The lineal is less spiritual. You see, it's more secular, and it becomes something where once you write down the word, then that word becomes oppressive.
What do you mean?
Because it's in writing.
What do you mean?
It's like, you know, we do that now. We'll say, oh, it's in a book. I had a teacher once said to me that as missionaries went into Africa and other areas, Catholic missionaries, that they didn't have a problem converting us because they had a superior religion, and the way that people knew that it was superior was because there was this book. That it was in writing, and it was something that they could point to in writing. So that what Plato was setting up was that you could use the written word to intimidate people and have them feel that something was truer because it was in writing.
Good evening and welcome to For the People and the third part of our conversation with Dr. Donna M. Richards, author of Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. We continue our discussion of Plato's use of writing as a political tool.
What Plato was setting up was that you could use the written word to intimidate people and have them feel that something was truer because it was in writing. Okay? Now, that wasn't always the case, because at the time we're talking that he's writing and doing his work. You know how many people are reading? Not many. And that took a long time until the Gutenberg galaxy, where you had many, many more books available, the Gutenberg Bible, that it was made, the printing was such that there could be, you know, books, and if primarily it was the Bible, available to people on a large scale. But you're not dealing with primarily a population that was reading. Still, the way the chain of command worked, it was that those who were in a position to intimidate those who were not. You see, it wasn't, people mistake that. They think that it was Plato's objective to have everybody reading. That was not the case. His objective was to have them intimidated, that is, the people in the caves. I don't know if you know about his metaphor, but the people in the caves are the people who live in darkness, who can't see, to be intimidated by those, the philosopher kings, who are outside of the cave, who are in the light, who can see. And writing was very much a part of that. And it was a part of helping him to standardize this concept of truth. Okay?
Now, the purpose of writing now, ulterior and otherwise, is there any connection there today?
In the sense that we have to understand, we've got to be a multimedia people, okay? Writing is very important. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. Books are very important. They're also very limited. You see? That is only one way of, if I write something, then I shouldn't be relying just on a literate or literal interpretation of what it is I'm saying. If I do that, that's very closed. When you write poetry, when we compose music, okay, when we drum, all the things that we do, it allows for much more than a literal interpretation, so that we're able to get to a deeper level of reality. And all I'm saying is that we should not close out these other modes of expression, of communication, that they're very important. What we're doing now is very important. We cannot rely merely on the written word. Okay? And I think that there is a tendency for us not to understand that, for us to not understand the power that is in other modalities of ways in which we express ourselves. And even in the way that we use the written word, because our people did that. We used writing, but we used it in a more symbolic way.
Okay.
Okay.
What is the Europeanization of human consciousness?
It is the acceptance of what I'm calling the objectification of the universe, the materialization of the universe, so that again, spirit is denied, spirit is mistrusted, it is relegated to an inferior position. And what happens is then we think in ways that facilitate our oppression. We think in ways that deny our spiritual power. That's what I call the Europeanization of our consciousness, and that has been talked about by other authors. Asante talks about that. But it is a consciousness which reflects the European.
Someone sitting home might say, well, you know, what's the harm in listening to a little Bach, a little Beethoven, getting into some Milton, almost said Middleton, Milton. What's the harm?
The harm is that if you are a people who have been so conditioned as we have, that we have to even sit here and discuss, convince each other of what are our strengths, what did we lose, what did we have, who are we, in a positive sense, that your focus tends to become that little bit of Bach and that little bit of Milton and a little bit of this, so forth and so on, when you have not indeed understood the African worldview, African philosophy, African conceptions of truth, what African ritual is all about, ancient African history, African culture, that you have not, that needs to be your frame of reference. Then, when you get that little bit of Bach, you have a context within which to place it. What happens with us is the reverse. We have terms, and this comes out of the European Aili, the European concept of truth, like classical, okay? Classical is supposed to mean the highest form in any particular culture, right? It's what you value most. That's one meaning for classical. It also can be a reference point, a pinnacle, a high point. So we are raised to think that Bach, Beethoven, whoever, that represents classical music in a universal sense. That becomes our reference point. We're saying, well, that's the best. Everything else, and now we know we don't enjoy it the most. You know what I mean? We know that. But we feel a little bit, well, that helps to make us not quite, we haven't reached yet. You know what I mean? Whatever that point is we're supposed to reach, we haven't gotten there yet, because we still enjoy all this other music.
We got to be refined a little bit more.
Exactly. Okay? That's the danger. The danger is what we know of the culture of our oppressors and the place that it has in our value system, that is this superficial value system, which is a product of colonialism. It's being colonized. That's the danger. The danger is that we right now, the position that we're in, the condition that we're in, we need to be putting all of our energies into understanding who we are. Because by understanding that, that's what gives you the posture to be able to look critically at what has been imposed on us. We don't have a place to look critically at it because we are assuming the superiority of it. That's why I thought this study was important, because all you have to do is get outside of it, study the African worldview, and then you can be in a position to deny that reality.
So let me ask you this question to finish up with Plato. You would say that Plato played a great role in creating what we today call the European?
Yes.
And for what reason now?
Yes. What I see is that in the development of European culture, which is an ongoing process, in the fulfillment of the Aili, that there are certain seminal points seminal thinkers, doers, who at whatever point in history they were at, served a role of solidifying and further developing the definition of what it means to be European. Now, let's look at before Plato. What you have are a lot of European groups. You know, we can look at the Indo-Europeans, who have already, the Aili, I think, is in place, okay? How does it manifest itself? It manifests itself in aggression.
Aili meaning?
This cultural seed that for the Europeans is defined in terms of the need for power in order to achieve fulfillment. Okay, I believe that's unlike any other cultural Aili. Okay, so you see aggression. You already see the individualism. It would be good to look at Diop's work, for instance, in terms of looking at the features of what he calls the, you know, the Indo-European or the Northern Cradle. Okay, so you already see these things. However, it cannot become the world dominant power that it needs to be because they're not unified. Okay, so what do you need? You need something to begin to say to these people, you are one. You can gain more power by coming together. Because when you've got this strong destructive tendency, which is something that I talk about, you know, in the book, you see, there's an innate destructive tendency. You've got this individualism because we've already talked about the separation of the human being, right? You've got this aggressive tendency. Then if something doesn't bring you together, what will you do? You destroy each other, okay? Plato comes along and he uses the concept of truth, what would be called an epistemology, that's only the concept of truth, uses that as something around which people can come together and identify and say, okay, this is going to be us. Now, as I said, that didn't happen right away. He had to fight all these other people that would be dissonant, you know, voices. But eventually, yes, that became what Europeans identified with. They said this way of thinking, this rationalism, this extreme rationalism that helps us to control, it gives us the illusion that we are controlling the future, the past, the universe, and everything. This is us as European people. So he was key at that point. Now, then you get a little later stage. Here comes along, let's look at 312. What they call AD. Here comes Constantine. What does he do? He sees that what you need is a religious statement which will help to achieve this world domination, this power, help to bring these Europeans together so that they can have power over others. So he adopts Christianity, you see. And that gives him the model that he needs in order to say, we have the right, in fact, we have the mandate. And he said he personally had the mandate, and you need to look at his own quotes and the things that were written about him, to go throughout the world and in the name of this one true God, which was them, which was the Europeans, to make everybody into these Christians.
So he's adopting Christianity as a weapon of control.
Absolutely, and as it's compatible with the Roman Empire. On a political level, you've got this empire which is spreading and spreading and spreading, right? He wants control of that. He looks at this religion and he says, that'll do it. That will help me. What I'll do is say, look, there's only one God. Christianity comes along. There are all these other religions in the world. Christianity comes along and says, all of the other religions are false. All of them are bad. This is the one true one. Well, that fits. Then he says, I've been placed here to service this one true God. They put me here for this. I've got to conquer people so that they can, you know, be correct religiously.
I hate to do it, but go ahead.
All right.
But I have to. Go ahead.
What you gonna do?
No, go ahead. No, I'm just saying. That's what he's saying.
So that's what he's saying. You know, he had this vision, this dream with this cross, and the cross said, "Conquer by this." Now, this is all in his own words and in his friends Eusebius's words, right? And he takes this cross, made everybody make these crosses, and said, "Conquer by this," and they went into battle. They won, and that was it. He said, "Yeah, this is the thing." And I'm saying that at that point in the development of European culture, that was key. That became this solidifying, defining form, institution that would help to bring together
more monolithic.
Yes. What was Europe? What was it going to be? All fulfilling the Aili. Okay? Then at another stage, you get this definition of science doing that. Again, based on this concept of the object, that we are the scientists. This is the age of science. We are in the forefront of that. And therefore, we have the right to rule the world, really, because we are the scientists. We are the smartest people, most knowledgeable people. Capitalism at one point becomes that which brings together the European self-image and has them working as one, helping to further develop the Aili. So at different stages in European development, there is a need, there's this tendency to be fighting each other, you see, and then of course you have all the other people in the world who are also developing and responding to this, so you need ways of controlling them and ways of making sure your troops are tight and together. So you need something to rally around.
I want to ask you about Greek myth and how Greek myth help explain European violence.
Oh, well, I think it probably helps more to not so much explain it, but as to demonstrate it and the need for violence, which I think is part of the Aili. There is, well, let's not even look at, let's not look at the myth. Let's look at, let's go prior to that and look at Indo-European mythology. When you talk about Odin and these various gods who were the war gods, who had to be fed by human blood, who rewarded people with this heaven, you know, Valhalla, which was the warrior heaven, which was this great honor if you got to go there. And the emphasis was on individuals in battle. And, you know, the bloodier the battle, the better it was, because it made you a better person and so forth. Early Indo-European mythology is replete with or filled with these kinds of images and concepts. Within the Greek culture, we get the same thing, where violence is it's valued, it's sought after. There is some kind of fulfillment that comes out of it. Now, in terms of my analysis, it is that the Aili, again, you must understand, is incomplete, so that it's not in harmony with the universe. And I think the concept of harmony is a very important one for us as a spiritual people. And so it is like almost what Colby Cambone says, formerly Joe Baldwin. He says that that they come to be, the European, as being outside of nature, outside of that natural universe, which is a state of harmony. And therefore, there's this constant thrust to try to subdue nature, or to see that as an enemy, so that the emphasis is on confrontation, it's on destruction, and you see it within Greek culture, you know, as well. So that the Aili has to, it forces the collective, the group behavior to be destructive. Now that can bring us to even their concept of progress. We, as African people, accept this idea of progress, thinking that we've got to imitate Europeans, that, you know, everything that is technologically more efficient is better. The higher you can build buildings, the better it is. The more cement that you have, you know, the bigger the cities, and so forth and so on. We don't really look at where their idea of progress comes from. It comes from their worldview. And it is really about controlling nature. It is about, and the feelings of power that come from that for them. So we don't get feelings of power by controlling nature. Okay, that's the difference. It is about consuming the universe, consumption. So that now you get them talking about the problem of, what, ecological sanity, they call it? That's a very deep issue. But they are not prepared to deal with it because the culture doesn't have the wherewithal to deal with it. You can't deal with the concept of interrelationship of all of us as natural beings in the universe, and the balance and harmony when you're talking about things being objects. You can't do that because the way you think doesn't allow you to do it.
What problem does that present for African people? You talked about how Plato influenced European thinking, but here you have Africans, in African Americans in this case, in a culture where, as you indicated earlier, we are forced in many cases to ape European. How does this need to split the emotional and the rational, all right, to be like Plato, how does that impact on us?
Okay, what it does is that if we talk about having independent schools, which I think is what we need to be doing. We need to be having our own schools, because of course you've got to educate your own children. But in doing that, we need to be looking at what are the concepts that you're going to use as you develop your children. How are you going to make sure that they are being developed as African children? How are you going to guarantee that it is a spiritual conception of the universe that they learn to use so that they can be, that their energies can be liberated, can be released? What is happening is that we are using these same concepts that you've just referred to in dealing with our own children. What does that do to them? You know how we talk all the time about the problem of our children being turned off in school? You have teachers talking about, I can't reach them. We talk about, oh, this child is hyperactive, and so you want to give them drugs so that you can, you know, control them. What we're doing is trying to relate to our children using using alien concepts of not only truth, not only learning, but of the human being, so that the spiritual needs of our children are not being met in those school arenas. Because we've made the mistake of thinking that, see, what the academy means is that you separate out whatever is intellectual from everything else. So that in the European conception, an academy is a place where intellectual things go on and there's no place for anything else. That's not a realistic conception of a human being. Human being is a whole human being. So when you have a child in a school and in a classroom, they are not just this mind that you want to control.
Pump stuff in.
That you
Yeah.
pump stuff in and you're ignoring the rest of them and so forth. So that we have to find, for instance, I'm going to take something which will seem very simple to you, probably unimportant.
That would be good.
but to me is central, and it's a good example. If we are going to have to look at how do we build buildings? How do we build buildings in such a way that we help ourselves to communicate with each other and with our spirits? And how will that help us to think? How are we going to arrange classroom? We take for granted that you have to arrange a classroom so that you have these lines of seats, you know, and then we ask the children to, they come in there. You know, we talk about 5, 6, 7-year-olds, and they have to sit. And they have to sit absolutely still all the time. There's no other way that they do things. Suppose when we come together, we form circles. You see? Would that make a difference? That's what we have to begin to look at, is we have to question everything.
This is SCETV.
Watch it. Whoa! You'll like it.
Something's coming!
Oh, I don't know what it is.
But it is gonna be great!
This segment with a discussion of the concepts of lineal and cyclical time.
What was also important in the Europeanization of consciousness was the dominance or ascendancy of lineal thinking, sequential thought. That has become so assumed.
Now give me an example of that, what you're talking about.
Okay, that you always have to ask the question, what comes before what comes next in a lineal sequence, past, present, future, 1, 2, 3, things are always put in sequence. That is not the way things necessarily happen, but we are trained to think that way within a European context. In many African conceptions, the cycle is important. In nature, we see cycles. Remember I talked about the circle. The circle has a kind of connectedness that the line, you know, the broken line does not. So that through connected, we will very often stand in a circle, for instance. But we will also understand circular relationships, which is very important. In European conceptions, you're taught, their logic is always very lineal, it's very sequential. First this, then that, and so forth and so on. Again, that's a very simplistic way, you know, of looking at things. past, present, and future in European conceptions become separated. Now that's very important if we are, again, to understand the Europeanization of consciousness, the way you put it. Because Europeans do not see themselves as being spiritually and organically connected to their forebears and to those who will come after them. There is almost a competition that goes headed for the strip. Past for them is there to be conquered, you know, to rise above. The future presents a problem to them. They're not really connected to it, and it is to be feared. You're afraid of what's going to happen, so what you need to do is to control it. For us, past, present, and future really, it's almost like they collapse into one time frame, and we are able to experience ourselves as being all of those at one time. And that's the significance of ancestor communion. For us, those who came before us live in us. And those who will come after us, the seeds of them are already in the past. And so our forebears, our ancestors, will be reborn symbolically in those who come after us. So what you get is a continuum, and then that circle is very important. Now that is because we can conceptualize on a sacred plane. That's sacred time, that's special time, that's extraordinary to us, you see? Whereas lineal time is only mundane. It's only, you know you got to get up a certain time in the morning because you got to do something in the next hour and so forth. But that lineal time was a way of controlling people when they had to work in the factories, you see, when they had to work like machines. It makes for technological efficiency. So you can't put concepts of sacred time in that if you're going to control people. Now, what Mbidi does in his book, the book is African Religions and Philosophies. And I believe that this brother had good intentions. And there's a lot of information, you know, in the book. He was trained in a Christian seminary, and he was also an anthropologist. And what he wanted to do was to present what he thought were the religious and philosophical concepts of his people to the world as being, you know, they could stand on their own and, you know, they're as good as anybody else's. It's kind of this apologetic thing. But what he ends up doing is using, again, this shows you the danger of, he uses a European worldview, a European way of looking at reality to explain African concepts, and you cannot do it. So he ends up by saying that Africans, what does he say? He says they worship the past, which is not the case, because the ancestors are not past and we don't worship them. We acknowledge that they live in us and that we are what we are partly because of who they are. That's very different from what he says. He also says that African religious concepts are two-dimensional. And by that he means that they only deal with past and present, that there is no future in them. Now what is he doing? He is assuming a European lineal conception of past, present, and future, saying that they conceive of future and we don't, which is not the case. And he is making the mistake of thinking that past, present, and future in the European conception are different dimensions, and they aren't. They are all part of one dimension, which is a line. A line is only one dimension. The African universe, and why we can have sacred time, is multi-dimensional, as I have said before. So a line does not begin to explain our spiritual concepts. And that's the mistake that Mbiti makes in his work. And the importance of pointing to that is that it shows why it's so important for us to be able to get outside of a European frame of reference so that we can then look critically at these concepts. And many of us have not been able to do that.
Okay, science in European culture, what role does it play?
Okay, it plays a role of, well, you know, it's like they replaced the concept of God with the concept of science, where everything is done in the name of science, and it becomes its own justification that you can do anything if you're saying that it's in the name of science or it's in the name of progress, that those two go together. But given an African conception, science, again, would not be separated from the spiritual. See, we always have to include the spiritual in everything that we do. That does not mean that we don't involve ourselves in science. It merely means that there also has to be the level or the basis of meaning. There also have to be a basis for ethics, for morality. And what you lose in the European concept is any way of answering questions as to why you're doing what you're doing. Science becomes an end in itself. It becomes the sanction for everything else. And so it becomes an ideology. And we can talk about scientism becoming a way of thinking where everything is done in the name of developing more and more control over nature. That's what science is for the European. That cannot be science for us. Okay.
Let me ask you this question. I'm going back to Plato one more time and his impact on the development of European religion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thought you were going to say science.
No, no, no.
Okay, of European religion is that he provides the model for the for monotheism, the one God concept. He talked about the good, and they just took it and made it the God, where what you had to do was to have this this supreme principle, which was remote, detached, abstract, and above everything. That is his, he called it the forms. That's the good, the true, the beautiful, and so forth. And within European Christianity, that becomes the idea of God, which, by the way, again, is very different from African concepts of a universal force that exists in us and exists in everything. It is not remote from us, but we are a part of it. That's a very, very different concept. The European concept becomes oppressive.
What do you mean?
That it is this being which exists a part of you. It is remote apart from you. It is remote from you, and you are always trying to kind of, approach it. And it puts out these edicts that you have to then, you're never good enough. In the African conception, you are sacred because you were born into a sacred universe, and spirit exists in you. Now, another influence that Plato had on their religious conception was the whole thing of having to write down your beliefs spiritually, that somehow that literate modality, again, that made it better because it was codified. And again, as we said before, that could then be used to oppress people by it being codified. Another influence, this is a very important influence that I think Platonic conceptions had, and that is the relationship to nature, to the natural self. What is taught in European Christian thought is that the natural part of ourselves is really to be controlled, to be tamed, cannot be trusted. And so what you're doing through religion is that you're kind of putting your nature in check. Plato said exactly the same thing when he talked about his concept of nature. The natural was what had to be controlled. The natural was the lesser than, the worser part of the human being. And you can find quotes to this effect, you know, in the Republic and other places. So that then when the religion is formulated, what you get is the same view of nature as being negative. Now, that's important for us because we become the people who represent nature, and indeed we do. So then we are the people who, through proselytization, you know, through being missionized and converted and so forth, are being saved from nature, from our natural selves.
All right, we got quite a few more areas we want to touch on, so I'm going to rush right along into, I know we're working you hard, Gnosticism. Gnosticism, and what is Gnosticism, and why did Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, oppose it?
Okay, I can do that fairly quickly.
Okay.
Because I think what this points to, what I'm trying to do throughout is to show a consistent development. The consistency is the Aili, which is always seeking greater and greater power, so that when you reach a point in European development where things seem to be maybe conflicting with the achievement of power, it's going to find a way to submerge it, to subdue it, and to get it out of the way. Okay, so as I said before, Constantine sees the use of the Christian model in such a way that will support the need for world dominance, okay? What the Gnostics said, this was an early Christian group that was really following a model of the African mystery system, what we refer to as that. That system put emphasis on internal spiritual development, again, on self-knowledge, on trying to reach what they called the gnosis, which is enlightenment, which is spiritual fulfillment, illumination. This comes straight out of African civilization. All African learning involves that, okay? So that this was a group of people who took the Christian mythology and used the mode of the mysteries. And they would come together in groups and talk and try to develop themselves spiritually and so forth. Now, there were problems with that. Because given a spiritual conception of the universe, which they had, okay, they said that the importance of the myth about Jesus was that it pointed to the ability of all human beings to be reborn spiritually, and that it was a symbol of that rebirth. That was an important point. Another important point about their organization was they didn't believe in hierarchy. They would come together in groups. It's almost like you have a study group now. And you learn from each other.
No bosses.
Exactly. Okay, so that was an important point. Another point we could make is that the female principal, or women, had a more important part to play in their group, okay? Now, but institutionalized religion had an ideological role to play, okay, a political role to play in the formulation and the solidification of the European empire, okay, in order to fulfill the Aili, which is seeking power. Constantine sees this. Others see this. What would help that to happen is to have an institution, the church, which has a hierarchy, which has a chain of command. Okay, that's one thing. So keep that in mind. So the Gnostics are a threat to that because they're saying, no, we don't recognize any hierarchy. Very importantly. Now this fascinates me, this point, but you just got to follow me along, okay?
We're following you on this one.
All right.
Go ahead.
There is what we call the Apostolic Church, the apostles. What they say, and this is what most Christians would say, is that the resurrection of Jesus was an actual, I don't think actual is a good word here, physical occurrence, an historical occurrence. Now, question is, why do they put so much emphasis on that? Okay? The Gnostics said that that whole concept was to be understood symbolically, again, as pointing to the idea of how you could resurrect the spirit. And so it was a spiritual concept, okay? Now, we know that we had concepts of resurrection long before the Jesus story, right? So that the meaning of that has to do with the regeneration of life, okay? And with illumination and coming to know self and so forth. It's a very deep concept. The Apostolic Christian Church said that it had only to be understood as an historical, physical occurrence that took place just like you and I are sitting here.
The resurrection.
Yes, that it was not to be understood spiritually or symbolically. Why? Why did they put so much emphasis on that? Because then what they said was, this took place at a particular point in time, particular place, and there were people who saw it. Why are they so important? Because those people can then say, well, Jesus said to me, do this, build this, okay? Upon this rock and so forth. And those people who actually witnessed this physical occurrence, then pass on authority, which they have gotten directly from this person.
By being in the presence.
By being in that presence. They pass it on. Then that group passes it on. That is the concept of the Apostolic Church. What are you passing on? You're passing on authority. You're passing on the sanction to be able to say, we control this, and we can tell you what is right and what is wrong and so forth, and what to do and how it should work. So that papal authority to this day
in the Catholic Church,
is based on that foundation of being able to say that this is something that occurred at a specific time in a specific place, and there were these people who saw it, and they then had the authority to then give us the authority. So you see how organization is involved, ideology is involved, and that it had to serve a particular purpose of political purpose of achieving power. The Gnostics would get in the way of that. And there were other heretics, they called them heretics also, who were giving different interpretations of the teachings that didn't fit the objective of gaining power. The Gnostics were saying, no, that's not the important thing. Everybody can experience this rebirth and this resurrection. And everybody can become spiritually illuminated. But it takes work, and it takes spiritual work.
Now to the Judeo-Christian split, which is just as interesting.
Yeah, I enjoy talking about that.
Okay.
Okay. the background that I'm assuming that people would know, because I don't have time to go through all of that, is the extent to which Judaism embodied the values and principles that we're talking about. They were part of European culture. Okay, very, very, the monotheism, the written codification, okay? Also patriarchy, by the way, but that's another issue. So then you have the Christian formulation, which comes directly out of that, right? So then the question, I remember I was young and always raised in my mind, well, why then this antagonism? Why the need to say, you know, that one was wrong and one was right and we're not them and so forth, when they're really, you know, the same thing? The answer is always political and in terms of power when you're talking about European culture. And that's what the concept of Aili helps us to do. Always look for what are the political implications? What are the implications for the development of European culture?
Look at the power trail.
Exactly. And that's what it is a trail. What Judaism did was to say to its people, which was a small group of people, you are a special people. You have been put here to be a model. And through your actions, others will learn and they will see that. But still, they're not going to be you. They aren't going to be the chosen people. They aren't going to be the special people ever. You have been put here for that special reason. Okay? What Paul begins to do is something else. That statement, the statement that the Jewish people are making within that religious context is not one that can be used for expansion. They aren't seeking converts. You see? They're saying, we're special. And we're an elite, whatever we are, and we're content to remain that way. We know we're superior.
We don't want to convert anybody.
We don't want to convert anybody because you can't be us. But the European, how should I put it, ego, self-image is expanding. It's got to grow because they're talking about world domination. They want to conquer people. How can they use the religion to conquer people and at the same time say, you can't be in this? They couldn't do that. So what changes is the whole definition of the Gentiles and that they could also be saved. So that Paul can then preach, people can then preach, if you come into this thing, we can then save you. Well then now, so what do you gain by that? You gain the same way that the Romans were able to go around the world and say, look, we'll make you a Roman citizen. And then by that, you become civilized. And still, they maintain power. Okay? This uses the religion to say, become a Christian. You will be saved. But it's like being saved in their image. Because still, it's Europeans in control. Europeans in dominance. The Jewish statement was too contained, okay, too tribalistic in a sense, to allow for that. And it's a question of rhetoric as well. What has worked so well in European Christianity to colonize all of us is the rhetoric of saying, we love you, and we have this gift to share with you, and we're doing this for you. You know, the whole brotherhood rhetoric. That is only rhetoric that is meant for those who would be victims of the colonial thrust, of the imperialistic thrust. Okay, that rhetoric was not in the Jewish statement. Didn't say. In fact, you need to look at Deuteronomy, You need to look at the Old Testament. It's very clear. It's saying you do whatever you have to do to those other people who believe in those other gods. Kill them, their children, the babies. Now, this is in the Bible. I don't know to what extent people, you know, have carefully read that, but look in Deuteronomy. It is very clear. It's a very aggressive statement in the sense of, it's really defensive, saying protect yourself against those false gods and kill anybody that you have to who is trying to get you to believe in any other god. Okay? But it's not about them trying to go throughout the world and convert other people. The conversion, missionizing aspect of Christianity is based on imperialism and the need for greater and greater power. Otherwise, you would recognize other people's religious forms, spiritual forms, whatever, and say, oh, they're fine.
This is SCET.
Good evening and welcome to the final part of our conversation with Dr. Donna M. Richards, author of Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior.
What I'm arguing in the chapter on religion and ideology that we have not understood as a people is that every religion is a statement of, it is a sacralizing, a making sacred of a nationalist ideology. Every religion says to a particular cultural group, you are special, you are sacred, this is what you're supposed to be doing, you know, and this is why you're here, and so forth. Every religion is tied to culture, and what we have fallen for is this rhetoric of
You call it rhetorical ethic?
Yeah.
I think,
And also the what I call the syntax of universalism, which really got us, which is that there are universal religions, universal ways of thinking that go beyond culture. You see, that's there for everybody. Christianity's for everybody. Christianity has functioned in the service of European culture and for European power. Okay, now, the rhetorical ethic comes in. They're not going to say that. When they come to take over your land, they're going to say, we're here to love you. Right?
Speaking of taking over land, let me read a quote from Yurugu, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. The part that I'm looking for deals with the Leopold and his dealings in the Congo. And maybe you can comment on that. I think you were quoting Cohen, who says, quote, whole districts were depopulated. Of 8 villages with a population of over 3,000, only 10 persons were left. Of another district, the population dropped in 15 years from 50,000 to 5,000. The Bulangi tribe, formerly numbering 40,000, sank to 8,000. King Leopold, it is calculated, netted a profit of between 3 and 5 million sterling, and could call to God to witness the purity to his motives and his desire to promote civilization.
Okay, that might be Chinweizu. Is that Cohen's quote?
It says Cohen describes the situation.
Because there's another book I would refer everybody to, The West and the Rest of Us by Chinweizu, who is a Nigerian author who, it's such an indictment of European colonialism, and it talks about that as well. There's a lot in there that touches on what I'm trying to get at in this book. Because one of the things I'm trying to do is to show the consistency in European behavior towards Africans and other non-European peoples. One of the reasons that Leopold, who's only one, you know,
Right.
in many, we happen to know about him. You know, you could talk about Columbus and his governors and cutting off parts of people's hands and so forth. One of the reasons that they're able to do that is because they can make of human beings objects. Because they can see us as things. You see, and that's why it's important to see the relationship between Platonic thought as it has developed throughout European development and what we are taught in school and that behavior. And that's one of the things that I wanted to do in the book is it's easy for us to hear this as an atrocity story. Say, that's an exception, isn't that horrible? But we need to see that in a very meaningful way, philosophers like Plato, who we say are so wonderful, okay, Descartes, all right, I would say even Niebuhr, Reinhold Niebuhr, who is a Christian philosopher, that they are connected to that behavior because they support a worldview, or they affirm and teach a worldview which makes it possible. That's what we need to see. We need to see the connection. We also need to see that given the Europeans' approach to reality and their lack of relationship to spiritual reality, that they are able to have that kind of behavior, the physical destruction of human beings, and at the same time to use the name of their God in relationship to it. And there's no contradiction. I have a quote somewhere from the Special Forces, which says, "Oh God, in your name, help us, you know, to do what we have to do to these people, because we do it. You know, you have told us to do this." I have a quote. There's as Du Bois pointed out, the good ship Jesus, which was one of the first slave ships. Okay. There's no contradiction.
Naming a
because,
slave ship Jesus,
right,
the thought.
Right. And then they have a whole prayer about please don't let us lose too many people on this as we do this. Please, you know, make our injuries as few as possible as we go in to rape this land and take these people.
So let me ask you this. How do you see black missionary work today? That is, black churches who engage in...
Let me say, because I don't want to just point fingers at particular people, but that is one of the most extreme, no, not most extreme. It's not one of the most extreme. It's one of the most blatant, one of the most obvious examples of African self-hatred that we would experience. It is not one of the most extreme. I think that we all suffer from a self-hatred, and that it manifests itself in different ways. That certainly a missionary who is going among African people to preach a doctrine which implies their inferiority is a sad phenomenon, because they're talking about themselves. They have accepted another whole cultural form, whole cultural experience as being superior to who they are. And they have accepted that without thought, without questioning. What I'm trying to do is to get people to question at a fundamental level. That's what we need to go back and do. We need to question our basic assumptions about the nature of reality. And that's the hardest thing for people to do. So that a black missionary is denying spirituality, because they can't say, how can they say that these people that I represent, this form that I represent is more spiritual than what you have here? They can't say that. See what I'm saying? So they're in a religion which is denying spirituality.
And they're basically saying what the slave master said.
Precisely.
That you have no religion that's worthy of.
That's right. They have accepted that. So in order for them to accept that, what do they think about themselves? You see? It's Woodson all over again. Carter G. Woodson. You don't need the shackles anymore. You don't even need the back door and the sign saying go through the back door, because the conditioning is so thorough that we will make the back door ourselves.
I want to ask you about your thoughts on the so-called New World Order, but I want to read another quote that would touch on that. From your book again, Yurugu, African-Centered Critique of European Cultural Thought and Behavior. You're quoting J.B. Berry here. In the latter period of Greek history, which began with the conquest of Alexander the Great, there had emerged the conception of the whole inhabited world as a unity and totality, the idea of the whole human race as one. We may conveniently call it the ecumenical idea, the principle of the ecumene, or inhabited world, as opposed to the principle of polis, or city, promoted by the vast extension of the geographical limits of the Greek world resulting from Alexander's conquest, and by his policy of breaking down the barriers between Greek and barbarian. The idea was reflected in the Stoic doctrine that all men are brothers, and that a man's true country is not his own particular city, but the ecumene. It soon became familiar, popularized by the most popular of later philosophies of Greece, and just as it had been implied in the imperial theory of Rome, the idea of the Roman Empire, its theoretical justification, might be a common order, the unification of mankind in a single world embracing political organism. The term world, orbis, which imperial poets use freely in speaking of the empire, is more than a mere poetical or patriotic exaggeration. It expresses the idea, the unrealized ideal of the empire. There is a stone from Halicarnassus in the British Museum on which the idea is formally expressed from another point of view. The inscription is of the time of Augustus, and the emperor is designated as, quote, savior of the community of mankind.
That is an expression of the European Aili, is an expression of the European cultural ego, the need to constantly expand, to consume, and to control the universe and to dominate the world. It is, I would say, marketed as a spurious or doubtful humanism, universalism, desire to keep peace in the world, order the world, do away with difference. The Pax Romana, which was supposed to be this great peace that would be over the world, meant one thing. It meant Roman domination of the world. The same thing with Alexander, but more importantly, the same thing with Europeans now. And when I say Europeans, I hope everybody understands that I'm talking about European Americans as well. I'm talking about Europeans wherever they are. That this talking about uniting the world, there being one culture, one world, saving us from ourselves, so to speak, that is a rhetoric that we fall into. The Christian rhetoric is the same. It is this universalistic rhetoric talking about universal brotherhood, where actually what is being expressed is the Aili seeking to fulfill itself, the need to achieve more and more, greater and greater European dominance and power throughout the world. How did the Romans do it? They did it by saying, order in the world is brought there through us, by us. We are the ones who bring order. Well, that's the same thing as saying, as imposing your culture on another group of people so that you can control them, conquer them, subdue them, and make them victims. The statement that you read by Bury points to this tendency, this thrust of European culture, which is to rule the world. It's that simple.
Does it not show you also how old this idea
Exactly.
is? That it's an old one.
Exactly. And it shows you the consistency. Another thing that we fall prey to is when so-called liberals, critics of European society would say that this only existed at a certain time, or it only exists now, or this is an exception. They avoid the fact that, or the reality that there has always been a consistent thrust of European culture. And that is this drive. I have another African term that I use for that. The energy source is the utama rojo, this drive to seek power, to seek control. And that has been consistent, and it expresses itself in terms of what he calls this ecumenical thrust, which sounds wonderful, bringing everybody together. But you bring everybody together under you. So it is consistency that we look for when we use the concept of Aili.
What do we do to ourselves when we hear President Bush or Clinton speak about the new order and anticipate that order? And how should we? Are there any tools of analysis, tools of, I don't know what the word is, that we can use that would make us, when we hear things, say, okay, bing. Is there anything?
Absolutely. And tools of analysis is exactly what it is. And that's why I've developed, or we have developed the concept of Aili, and some other concepts that go along with Aili. You hear a statement from Bush, you hear a statement from Clinton, whoever it is, and right away what you say is, okay, how does this fit the Aili? Okay?
The Aili being
the ideological core of the culture, which helps you to see what is the political function of whatever it is that is being done or said. It is the seed of the culture which continues to develop, but it is the ideological core. It is the matrix. It is the essence and the place wherein all the different aspects of the culture come together and can be understood as monolith, as one thing, okay? Now, this concept is simple. It helps to do away with all of the confusion. I have used it in an after-school program that I have in Harlem, where I work with young people. That once you identify this Aili, you just plug it in. The light goes off, as you said, and you say, or the light goes on, And you say, aha, now, how should I interpret that? I used an example with the children. There was a headline in the paper. Bush sends so many thousands of troops into the Sudan, into Somalia, right? And I asked them, then it says, he is concerned that people be fed, okay? I had laid out the whole conceptual model of Aili to them, and then we had interpreted European culture using that model. Then I said, now, how would you analyze that statement? Okay? All right? What we're looking at is the logic of European culture. That's what you have to do. You have to say, how does it work? That's what the Aili tells you. Okay, so you don't get fooled by the rhetoric. So I said to them, and they could say to me, does it make sense knowing the European Aili, knowing how they have functioned throughout history, that Bush is going to be concerned with us eating? Does that make sense? No, it doesn't fit. You see, it's inconsistent. It doesn't make sense. Then why would we think then? How do we need to look at him sending these troops in? The answer becomes because it's a way of extending the power of the United States, of Europe, of whatever. Okay, so it makes things very simple for you and allows us.
Well, someone cutting you off, someone watching might say, well, I am an American, as a black American, so what, if America expands its power, my power is expanded also.
Okay, and that person has to understand what they're giving up, okay, what they've committed themselves to. Now, I'm gonna say this on one level, which may not be meaningful for everybody, but needs to be, and that is on a spiritual level. That given the African conception of life, your life is not separate from that of other African people, nor is it separate from all of African existence in sacred time, not lineal time, which means that we have an accountability to our ancestors and to those who come after us and to the community. And so that you may think that you can get away with this and get certain advantages, possessions, or whatever it is that that person is seeking for yourself. You see, and that's your reward. The spiritual reality is that you are accountable to something much larger than that. And so that you are fooling yourself. That is an illusion for you to think of yourself as an individual or as an American, because certainly the Europeans don't think of you as that. See, you've gone for the rhetoric in doing that. One of the most devastating things about the European worldview and about European ideology for us as a people is individualism. Individualism is their basis for functioning. Individualism is devastating to African people. Connectedness is our strength. Community is our strength. Okay? So that person who makes that argument is very, very short-sighted, to put it mildly, and is seeing things in a very limited context. Now, you may not be able to convince them of that, okay? It will come out eventually, but people, because of how they've been conditioned, will have to see it.
Well, I have to ask you this before I leave the Sudan area. And why is it that Adid and the other factions in the Sudan, why are they called warlords? Not that they are good guys. I don't know whether I don't know about them.
Right.
Why are they called warlords?
Right.
And the folks in Bosnia,
Very good.
why are they just, I guess, leaders or whatever? I
Right.
don't. Why?
Because of the importance of language, the connotation that language has. We've fallen for that. It is a trap. It immediately puts them into a certain context. Whenever the American public is to be galvanized around, you know, a president's action against some non-European country, you notice this. The terms barbarism, barbaric, will always come into play. That immediate, what that's doing is setting up your thinking, and to me it goes again back to Plato, where the warlord, see, represents disorder, represents the chaos that must be ordered. So you have the saving troops going in to make order. So that's why they got to be called warlords, just like African nations and language groups being called tribes, because the association, you see, is with war and
even though the folks in Yugoslavia are maiming children and killing children.
Exactly. You're not gonna find those same terms being used, because what you want to do is to call forth, it's very interesting, certain ideas that are attached to certain feelings that will make us then indict our own people and identify with the Europeans who are going in. One thing that I want to say that's important and also maybe a little difficult to understand, but as the key is, and I would say to everybody, study the African worldview. Study our conceptions of the universe. Come back to who we are.
No matter how much involved you become in European culture, etc., can you ever become master?
Right. Good.
In that house.
Okay. Obviously, the answer is that you can't. That it is constructed so that you cannot become that, and it will never be yours. But the illusion is, and that's how they've done their job well, is that you know, everybody can move up in this. Look at what's happened. You know, you've got a Colin Powell, you see, so you can become whatever there is to become. Doesn't matter that he or anybody else has to be functioning in the interest of European power.